Cutter's Bend, September 1878. Snow falling hard. 11 women already chosen. One left standing at the end of the line, hands locked around a worn carpet bag, chin up, giving nothing away. A man stepped close, looked her over slow, and said with a smirk, "Past your bloom." Nothing particularly striking. Then the thunder hit. Hooves. 3 horses tearing through the white curtain of snow. 3 brothers. And the oldest one walked straight past every other woman on that platform, straight to her. "We aren't buying property today," he said, low and steady. "We're looking for an equal partner." Eloise Vance glanced at the mountains she couldn't even see yet. Then she picked up her bag. "When do we leave? The full story starts right below, and trust me, you won't want to stop." The snow came early to Cutter's Bend that September. It fell in thick, heavy curtains, the kind that swallowed sound and made the world feel smaller than it already was. The stagecoach depot sat at the edge of town, like a forgotten thought, a long wooden platform, a few oil lanterns fighting the gray, and a hand-painted sign that creaked and swung in the wind. Eloise Vance stood at the far end of that platform. Position 12 out of 12. She hadn't counted herself into that spot. The other women had simply drifted toward the warmth of the lanterns, toward the center of things, and she had let them. She was good at that, making herself small when the world expected it. She pressed her carpet bag against her side with both hands, her wool coat doing almost nothing against the cold, and she watched the town of Cutter's Bend watch her back. She was 23 years old. She had buried her parents by 16, taught schoolchildren by 19, and balanced ledgers that grown men couldn't make sense of by 21. She had crossed 3 states in a rattling coach with strangers who smelled of tobacco and anxiety, to end up here, at the last stop, in the snow, with 11 other women who had already stopped looking at her. That was fine. Eloise had learned early that being overlooked wasn't the same as being nothing. The selection had begun an hour ago. It worked the way. These things always worked. Men from the valley came up, one by one, looked the women over the way you'd inspect a piece of furniture, and made their choices. There were ranchers, shop owners, a schoolmaster, a man who said he ran a boarding house but had the eyes of someone who'd never swept a floor in his life. They picked the youngest first, then the prettiest, then the ones who smiled fast and asked no questions. By the time the line thinned to 4, Eloise had stopped watching them leave. She was looking at the mountains instead. The peaks above Blackwood Valley were invisible behind the clouds, but she knew they were there. She could feel them. Something about the air here was different from the flat plains she'd crossed, heavier, more honest, like the land wasn't trying to be anything other than exactly what it was. She respected that well. The voice came from her left, and she turned slowly. Hiram Sterling was not a tall man, but he carried himself like one. His coat was expensive wool, his boots were polished despite the snow, and his smile sat on his face the way a trap sits on the ground perfectly still, waiting. He had the look of a man who had never once been told no, and had therefore concluded that no was a word invented by lesser people. He looked her over once, top to bottom. The kind of look that was meant to make a person feel like an object being appraised and found wanting. "Past your bloom," he said, almost to himself. Slender frame, nothing particularly striking. He tilted his head. "I run a house on the edge of the valley. Coal operation. Mostly, I need someone to cook, clean, manage the domestic side of things." He said domestic, like it was a kindness he was offering. "I'll take you in. You'd have a roof. That's more than most in your position can expect." Eloise looked at him for a long moment. She thought about saying something sharp. She had plenty of sharp things stored up, but she also recognized that Hiram Sterling was the sort of man who would take sharpness as a personal insult and then make her pay for it slowly, in small ways, over a long time. She had known men like him before. They were very consistent. "I'll consider my options," she said. His smile tightened. "There aren't many left. There's always at least one." He opened his mouth, And then the sound hit. Thunderous, rolling out of the snow-packed road like something from the bottom of the earth. Hooves, a lot of them, moving fast, and the jingle of harness. And then 3 horses came through the white curtain of falling snow, like they'd been built specifically for weather like this. Big animals, sure-footed and blowing clouds of steam into the frozen air. The riders pulled up at the platform's edge, and for a moment, nobody spoke. 3 men. Brothers, clearly same broad shoulders, same dark hair dusted with snow, same economy of movement as they swung down from their saddles. But past the surface similarities, they were entirely different creatures. The eldest moved like a man who had carried heavy things for a very long time and had made peace with the weight. He was quiet in a way that wasn't emptiness. It was more like a held breath or a banked fire. His eyes swept the platform once, and something in them sharpened when they landed on Elowin. The middle one was watching everything, with the kind of focused attention that made you feel like you were being understood faster than you'd like. He pulled off, one glove already reaching for something, in his coat. A ledger, it turned out. Even in the snow, he was already working. The youngest grinned. Not at anyone in particular, just at the situation, at the snow, at the absurdity and adventure of being alive on a cold mountain morning. He caught Elowin's eye and tipped his hat like they'd already been introduced and were simply catching up. Hiram Sterling cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, you're a little late. The best of the lot are already spoken for." He gestured vaguely, down the platform, though I suppose there are still a few to choose from. The eldest Garrett Buckthorne didn't look at him. He was looking at Elowin. He walked past the other women without hesitation, past Hiram, past the lanterns, and the remaining hopeful faces. His boots hit the wooden boards in a steady, unhurried rhythm, and he stopped in front of her with about 2 feet of cold air between them. He was close enough that she could see the snow caught in his eyebrows. Close enough that she could tell. Quiet wasn't coldness, it was something more complicated. Something earned. He looked at her the way she had looked at the mountains. Like he was reading something real. Behind them, a small crowd had gathered. Townspeople, a few of the other men who'd already made their selections. Some of the remaining women on the platform. Everyone watching, everyone quiet. Garrett turned to face them. When he spoke, his voice was low, but it carried. It had the kind of weight that doesn't need volume. "We aren't buying property today." He let that sit for a beat. "We're looking for an equal partner. A woman's worth isn't measured by her silk dress or timid smile, but by the grit she shows when her world falls apart." Someone in the crowd murmured. Hiram Sterling's expression did something complicated and quickly settled back into blankness. Elowin's grip on her carpet bag loosened, just slightly. She studied Garrett's face. She had learned, through years of reading ledgers and reading people, that the most dangerous thing in the world was a man who said the right thing, because the right thing was easy to say. It cost nothing. What mattered was the architecture underneath what a person did when the words ran out and reality moved in. "That's a fine thing to say in front of a crowd," she said. Garrett held her gaze. "It's a fine thing to mean." She waited. He didn't look away. Beside him, the youngest brother, Jed, spread his hands and said cheerfully, "We've got 18,000 acres, 312 head of cattle, 1 very opinionated cook, and a set of ranch books that would make a grown man cry. We're not looking for someone to pour tea. We're looking for someone who can look at a disaster and figure out where to start." The middle brother, Thorne, glanced up from his ledger, long enough to add, "The pay is fair. The work is real. And nobody on Buckthorn Ridge tells you what to think." Hiram made a sound in the back of his throat. "She's a woman alone, with no family, no connections, and no better prospects. You're doing her a charity by looking twice." Garrett looked at him then. Just looked. Hiram went quiet. Elowin exhaled through her nose. She looked at the mountains she still couldn't see. She thought about what she'd left behind the failed school. The empty rooms, the ledger books she'd kept, for men who paid her half what the work was worth, and thanked her? Not at all. She thought about what it meant to be offered a roof and called lucky for it. Then she picked up her carpetbag. "When do we leave?" she said. No, kept falling. Jed grinned wide enough to mean it. Thorne made a note, and Garrett Buckthorne offered his hand to help her down off the platform, not pulling her, not guiding her, just offering, and waited for her to take it on her own terms. She did. The ride-up took 4 hours. Elowen spent the first hour watching the town disappear behind her. The second hour, watching the trees thicken and crowd the trail. The third hour, watching the trail itself narrow until it was barely wide enough for the wagon, with rock face on one side and a long drop on the other. By the fourth hour, she had stopped watching and started listening. The mountain had its own language, weaned through pine, the distant percussion of water moving under ice, the horses breathing in rhythm with the climb. She sat in the wagon bed with her carpetbag across her knees and let the sounds settle into her. Jed rode alongside and narrated as he went, the way some people can't help themselves when they're proud of something. The South Pasture, the Upper Creek, the Ridge Trail that became impassable in deep winter. He pointed things out like he was introducing her to friends. Thorne drove the wagon in silence and occasionally made notes in his ledger, balancing it on his knee with the ease of long practice. Garrett rode ahead. He hadn't said much since Cutter's Bend, but twice, when the trail bent and the drop appeared suddenly at the wagon's edge, he'd positioned his horse between her and the void. Without comment, she noticed. She didn't say anything either. Buckthorn Ridge came into view through a break in the trees, and Elowen's first impression was size. The ranch house was big and plain, and clearly built to last heavy timber and stone no ornamentation. Windows facing the valley, like eyes open to weather. Behind it, barns and outbuildings spread across the ridge in organized clusters. Corrals, a smokehouse, a long bunkhouse with lamplight already bleeding through the shutters. 18,000 acres, Jed had said. She believed it now. What she hadn't expected was the men. 35 of them, roughly. They materialized from the barn, from the corrals, from the bunkhouse doorway, and they lined up with their hats in their hands and their faces arranged into varying degrees of skepticism. Some were polite about it. Others weren't bothering. A short, barrel-chested man with a flour-dusted apron and the expression of someone perpetually disappointed in humanity planted himself at the front of the group. He looked at Elowen with the specific displeasure of a man who had expected something different and was not adjusting his expectations accordingly. "Cookie," Jed said, pleasantly. "This is Elowen Vance. She'll be." "I know what she'll be," Cookie said. "Question is whether she knows what she's walked into." He squinted at her. "You cook?" Elowen met his squint with a level look. "Depends on what you've got to work with. Sourdough starter that's older than you, half a crate of dried beans, salted pork that could walk off under its own power." He crossed his arms. "Still feel like cooking. I feel like looking at that starter first. If it's actually older than me, it's either magnificent, or it's the reason your men have been complaining about their digestion." One of the hands behind Cookie made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly converted into a cough. Cookie stared at her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward the kitchen. "Well, come on then," he said over his shoulder. "Daylight's not waiting." Elowen followed him. Inside, the kitchen was large and battered and full of character in the way that rooms get when people actually live in them. Pots blackened from use. A work table scrubbed pale, bundles of dried sage and something she couldn't immediately identify hanging from the rafters. She went through his shelves without asking, not ransacking, but reading the way you read a ledger, methodically, looking for what's there and what's missing and what the gaps tell you. Cookie watched her from across the room with his arms still crossed. She found his sourdough starter in a clay crock near the warmest corner of the kitchen. She lifted the cloth, smelled it, closed her eyes for a moment. "This is good," she said. "This is genuinely good." Cookie's arms loosened a fraction. 42 years. That's what it smells like. She set the cloth back carefully. You've been feeding it with the wrong flour ratio for about the last 6 months, though. That's why the bread's been coming out heavy. Silence. Who told you the bread's been coming out heavy? Cookie said. Nobody. But if this starter's 42 years old and being kept by someone who clearly knows what they're doing, and the ratio's off, the bread would be heavy. So either that's true or something else changed recently. She paused. Different flour supplier? Cookie's jaw moved. October last year. New merchant out of Billings. Different grain blend. That'll do it. She turned back to the shelves. If you've got any rye in here, we can adjust. If not, we compensate with longer proof time. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to win him over. She simply knew what she knew, and she said it. And Cookie stood in his kitchen and watched her the way a man watches something he wasn't expecting and isn't sure yet whether to be relieved or annoyed. By dinner, he let her stand at the stove beside him. By the time the hands filed in and the bowls went around, he was telling her where the spices were kept without being asked. That evening, after the kitchen was clean and the hands were back in the bunkhouse and the house had gone quiet, Thorne came to find her in the study. He set the ranch ledger on the table in front of her without preamble. Jed says, "You're good with numbers." Jed doesn't know that yet, Elowen said. He's guessing. Are you? She pulled the ledger toward her, opened it, ran her finger down the first column, then the second, then turned 3 pages and ran her finger down those 2. Good with numbers and good with ledgers are different skills, she said. I'm good with both. She stopped on a supply entry from August, then found the corresponding entry from May, then June. She set them side by side in her mind. Who manages your supply contracts? We use a merchant in Billings. Hap Mercer handles the ordering. How often does Hap check the invoiced price against the agreed price? Thorne's expression sharpened. He should be checking every time. He's not. She turned the ledger to face him and pointed. This entry, and this one, and here, again in September. The agreed rate per hundredweight on hay is 14 cents. You've been billed 16, 3 times. And the quantities received, she flipped back to the inventory log. Don't match the quantities invoiced. Thorne sat down. He leaned over the ledger with his elbows on the table, and for a long moment he just looked. Then he looked up at her. Something behind his eyes had gone very still and very focused. How long would it take you to go through the full year? He asked. If you let me work without interruption, I can have a preliminary summary by morning. He stood, went to the side table, and poured 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of her and took the other to the chair in the corner. Then I'll stay out of your way, he said, and opened his own notes. They worked through the night like that. Him in the corner, her at the table, the lamplight burning low between them. By 2 in the morning, she had flagged 9 separate instances of overcharging across 4 supply categories. By 4, she had calculated the cumulative loss and cross-referenced it against the ranch's cash reserves to show exactly what the bleeding was costing them. She set down her pen when the gray pre-dawn started showing at the window. Thorne was watching her. He'd been watching for a while, probably. He had the look of a man recalculating something. You're not what I expected, he said. Most people aren't. She closed the ledger. You were expecting someone who needed to be taught. We were expecting someone who needed to be settled in slowly. He paused. I was wrong about the timeline. She took a long drink of cold coffee and decided that was as close to an apology as Thorne Buckthorne probably ever got, and that it was enough. The next morning, Jed put her on a horse. The mare was called Birdie. She was gray and calm and had wise eyes, and she picked her footing on the mountain trails with the careful attention of someone who has considered all the options and chosen the safest one. Elowen had ridden before, but not like this, not up switchbacks where the trail crumbled at the edge, not through pine corridors where branches brushed both shoulders at once. Jed rode beside her and talked, pointed out landmarks, showed her where the upper pasture opened out, and where you could see 3 valleys from the same spot on a clear day. He told her about each of the hands by name, who was steady and who needed watching, who had been with the Buckthorns for 12 years and who had arrived broke and half frozen the previous spring. He talked about the ranch the way you talk about something you love not to impress, just because it was worth saying. "You're not afraid of anything, are you?" he said at one point. Elowen considered the trail ahead. "I'm afraid of plenty. I'm just not willing to let it make the decisions." Jed thought about that for a moment, then nodded like she'd confirmed something he'd suspected. By the end of the first week, the hands had stopped looking at her sideways. They still kept a certain professional distance, but it was the distance of people adjusting their expectations, not dismissing her. Cookie asked her opinion on the bean recipe without being prompted. Hap Mercer, the foreman, handed her the incoming supply invoices the morning they arrived and didn't explain why. He just handed them over, which meant he'd already understood what she was for. She was becoming part of the architecture of the place. One evening, Garrett found her on the porch. She was looking at the valley below, where the last light was doing something gold and slow across the treetops. He stood beside her and didn't speak for a while. "The hands respect you," he said finally. "The hands respect someone who doesn't talk down to them," she said. "That's not complicated. You'd be surprised how many people get it wrong." She looked at him sideways. "You don't?" He was quiet again. The wind came through the pines below. "My wife used to stand on this porch," he said. The words were careful, measured, like he'd held them for a long time, and wasn't sure yet how much weight they could bear out in the open air. Elowen didn't fill the silence with comfort. Some silences don't need filling. She just stood there beside him and let it be what it was. After a while, he went back inside. She stayed on the porch until the last light was completely gone. The sickness started in the south pasture. 3 cows down on a Tuesday morning, 8 more by Thursday. By the end of the week, over 30 head were showing the same signs: dull eyes, off their feed, strange lethargy that came on fast and didn't respond to any of the usual remedies. Cookie said it was bad feed. Hap said it was the cold. One of the older hands shook his head and wouldn't say anything at all, which was worse. The rumors started in town before the week was out. Jed brought them back from a supply run with the kind of expression that meant he was trying to decide how angry to be. He found Elowen in the study and told her plainly. People in Cutter's Bend were saying the sickness followed her up the mountain, that she'd brought something with her, that a woman showing up alone, past her youth, without family or connections, and settling in with 3 men was an invitation for exactly this sort of trouble. Elowen listened to all of it without changing her expression. "Who's saying it?" she asked. Jed picked up a paperweight from the desk and set it down. "Sterling's people, mostly. But it's spreading. Hiram Sterling." She had thought about him since the depot, the polished boots in the snow, the appraisal disguised as an offer, the smile that didn't go anywhere near his eyes. "That's not superstition," she said. "That's strategy." She went to find Garrett. He was in the barn, working on a harness with the focused economy of someone who fixes things because leaving them broken is not an option. She told him what Jed had reported, and watched his face go quiet in that specific way. That meant he was controlling something. "You believe it?" he said. "I believe Hiram Sterling wants this land, and he's trying to give you a reason to lose confidence in it." She paused. "I want to ride the south pasture. It's not safe right now. The sick animals are." "I know what the sick animals are. That's why I want to see them." She held his gaze. "I won't make decisions based on what people say. I make them based on what I see." He handed her the harness without another word and went to get Bertie ready. She and Jed rode the south pasture that afternoon. It took 3 hours to cover the affected area properly, and Elowen moved slowly, deliberately, stopping often to look at the grass and the soil and the water sources. Jed rode alongside and watched her work without asking questions, which she appreciated. The river ran along the southern boundary. She found it by following the sound through a stand of cottonwood, and she crouched at the bank and looked at the water for a long time before she put her hand in. The current ran clear on the surface, but the rocks beneath her fingers had a faint residue she recognized, not from ranching, from something else. She had grown up near a tannery. The creek behind her parents' house had looked like this some mornings, when the weather was wrong and the runoff moved the wrong direction. She knew what industrial contamination looked like in water. She knew it in the smell and the feel of it, and in the specific way the moss grew or didn't grow near the bank. She stood up and dried her hand on her coat. "Where does this river come from?" she asked. "Comes down from the North Ridge, runs through the valley, hits the plain." Jed frowned, "Runs past Hiram's mining claim about 2 miles upstream." She looked north. "Then that's where we need to go," she said. They rode 2 miles upstream. The mining operation came into view around a bend in the river, a gash in the hillside, timber framing, equipment that had no business being this deep in the mountains without a serious investment behind it. There was a crew working, small figures moving against the rock face, and there was a drainage channel, clearly dug by hand, running from the operation directly toward the river's edge. Elowen got off Birdie and walked to the channel. She looked at what was running through it. She looked at the color of the water, where the channel met the river. She looked at the dead vegetation along the bank, in a strip exactly as wide and exactly as consistent as you'd expect from something slowly poisoning the water moving past it. She walked back to her horse. "He's running mining runoff directly into the river?" she said. "Toxic. Probably sulfur compounds, maybe heavy metals, depending on what he's pulling out of that rock face. It moves downstream, and the cattle drink from the south pasture water sources." She mounted up. "It's slow, deliberate. He's not just mining. He's poisoning the water supply to seize the downstream rights." Jed had gone very still. "That's not accidental." "No." He looked toward the mining operation. A muscle in his jaw worked. "We should go back and get Garrett, and Thorne, and maybe Hap, and possibly every man on the ranch who owns a—" "We go back," Elowen said, "and we document it. We collect water samples. We write down what we observed and when. We build a record." She kept her voice level. "And before we do anything else, we go into town. Because the miners working that operation didn't design this drainage system. They're workers. And if the water is poisoning our cattle, it's poisoning everything else downstream too." She turned Birdie back toward the trail. There was a settlement of mining families on the far edge of Blackwood Valley. Elowen knew it existed because Jed had mentioned it on that first ride up, offhandedly, as a place the Buckthorns had limited dealings with. She found it at the base of the North Ridge, a cluster of wood-framed houses. A shared well, children playing in the cold dust between the buildings, a general tiredness in the structures that came from people living at the edge of what they could afford. She went to the well first. She took a sample from it. Then she talked to a woman hanging laundry outside one of the houses, not about Sterling directly, but about the water and whether anyone had been sick and what the children had been drinking. The woman told her about the stomach problems, the headaches, how 3 of the younger children had been ill since August and nobody could figure out why since August. The same timeline as the cattle. Elowen stood in the middle of that small settlement with the water sample in her coat pocket and the woman's words sitting heavy in her, and she thought about the poster she'd seen in the window of the Cutter's Bend General Store. Hiram Sterling's name on a new mining lease. Hiram Sterling's name on a water rights filing. Hiram Sterling, who had looked at her on a platform in the snow and told her that a roof was more than she could expect. She thought about the miners who had dug that drainage channel under his orders, probably not knowing or not having the power to refuse. She thought about the children at the well. When the town council meeting happened 2 days later, a gathering that Thorne had quietly arranged, and the Buckthorns attended in a block, Elowen stood up before she was invited to. There were about 40 people in the room, ranchers, merchants, a few miners who'd come in from the valley. Hiram Sterling sat in the second row, with his hat on his knee and his face professionally neutral. Elowen spoke clearly, without heat. The river running through Blackwood Valley is being contaminated by industrial runoff from the buckthorn's northern boundary, upstream of every water source that serves this valley, human and animal alike. She paused. This is not a superstition. This is not a curse. This is chemistry and drainage, and a channel that was dug by hand pointing directly at water. The children drink. A murmur ran through the room. Every human being, she continued, whether a wealthy rancher or a hired miner, possesses a fundamental right to clean air and unpoisoned water. Her voice was steady. She wasn't performing outrage. She was stating a fact that was self-evident and that she wanted on record. Human dignity is not a favor to be granted. It is non-negotiable. And when someone deliberately undermines it for profit, that is not just a legal matter. It is a moral one. The room had gone very quiet. Hiram Sterling's neutral face stayed neutral, but his hands, she noticed, had tightened on the brim of his hat. Garrett, sitting in the row behind her, said nothing, but she heard him exhale slowly, and she understood that it was the sound of a man who had been waiting a long time to hear someone say the right thing in the right room. She sat down. The meeting lasted another hour. Nothing was resolved that day, these things never resolved in an afternoon, but she had said it out loud, in public, and people had heard it. The mining families specifically had heard it. The woman from the laundry line had come in late and stood at the back wall, and when Elowen caught her eye on the way out, the woman gave her a small, tight nod. That was enough for now. Outside in the cold, Thorne fell into step beside her. "You know he'll retaliate," he said. "Yes, that didn't seem to give you pause." She pulled her coat tighter. "It gave me plenty of pause. I just decided it wasn't a good enough reason to stay quiet." She looked at him. "Is that a problem?" Thorne was quiet for a moment. "No," he said finally. "It's the opposite of a problem." They walked back to the horses through the cold Blackwood Valley evening, and above them, the mountains held their silence, and somewhere upstream the river kept moving south, carrying what it carried, waiting for someone to make it stop. The storm announced itself 3 days before it arrived. Elowen noticed the signs first. The way the horses grew restless in their stalls at night. The particular stillness in the pines before dawn, like the trees were bracing. A pressure shift in the air that she felt behind her eyes and in the joints of her fingers. She mentioned it to Hap on a Tuesday morning, and he looked at the sky for a long moment, and then went and told the hands to double the hay stores in the upper barn. By Thursday, the clouds had stacked up over the north ridge like a wall, being built by something very large and very patient. The blizzard hit Friday at midnight. Elowen woke to the sound of it, not gradually, but all at once, the way you wake when a door slams. The wind was something she didn't have words for immediately. She lay in her bunk and listened to it, find every crack in the timber walls, and she thought about the cattle in the south pasture and the water lines and the supply of firewood stacked against the east side of the main house. She was dressed and in the kitchen before the fire had died to coals. By morning, the world outside the windows was white and moving. The drifts had buried the lower fence rails overnight. Visibility from the porch was about 20 feet before everything dissolved into the blow. The thermometer on the barn door read 16 degrees and was still falling. Garrett had been up before her. He came into the kitchen with snow on his shoulders and ice in his beard and told her in a flat voice that 3 of the hands were already out checking fence lines, and that the south herd had been moved to the lower pasture 2 days ago, per Hap's orders, so they were sheltered enough for now. "The mares," he said. "I need to check on them." Thorne looked up from the table. "Which ones?" "Clover. She's close." There was a silence that communicated more than any elaboration would have. Clover was a prize mare. Jed had mentioned her 3 times in the first week with the particular reverence cowboys reserve for exceptional animals. She was 3 days past her due date which already meant complications were possible. Adding a record blizzard to a difficult berth was its own kind of mathematics. "I'll come," Elowen said. Garrett looked at her. "I've helped with difficult berths before," she said. "Not horses specifically, but the principles don't change much." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, and handed her a spare coat from the hook by the door. His coat, much too large, but lined with sheepskin, and built for exactly this weather. She put it on without comment. They found Clover in the foaling stall at the far end of the main barn. Jed was already there, crouched in the straw with a lantern, his voice low and steady. The mare was down and sweating despite the cold, her sides heaving in the uneven rhythm that meant labor had been going wrong for a while. The barn was cold but windless, the blizzard howling against the walls and finding no purchase. The lantern threw warm gold light across the straw. All four of them moved into the stall, and the mare watched them with dark, exhausted eyes. "How long?" Elowen asked Jed. "4 hours. Maybe 5. The foal's positioned wrong." He kept his voice calm, but his hands were tight on the lantern handle. "We've had difficult presentations before, but not like this." Elowen knelt in the straw beside him and assessed. She was methodical and quiet about it, moving carefully, reading the situation the way she read ledger entries, looking for what was wrong and where it started, and what the correction needed to be. "Front legs need repositioning," she said. "She's exhausted from pushing. We need to work with her contractions, not against them." She looked at Garrett. "I need your hands. You're stronger than I am, and I'll need that." She looked at Jed. "Talk to her. Keep talking to her. She trusts your voice." Jed moved to Clover's head immediately, his mouth already moving. Low sounds that weren't quite words, but had the cadence of reassurance. What followed was 2 hours of the hardest work Elowen had done in her adult life. The cold was constant. The straw was rough on her knees. There were moments where the mare's distress was difficult to witness, and she had to force herself to stay technical, to think about mechanics and timing, instead of feeling the weight of it. Garrett worked beside her with a steadiness that matched her own. He did what she told him, when she told him, with no unnecessary commentary and no hesitation. When she needed force, he applied it precisely. When she needed him to wait, he waited. It was the most intimate collaboration she could remember, not in a romantic sense, but in the deeper sense of two people working together at the limit of what they could manage. Thorne kept track of timing, watched for signs of secondary distress, and had warm water ready at every moment it was needed. At the 2-hour mark, the foal arrived. It came in a rush and a mess, and a silence that lasted about 4 seconds before the newborn made a sound. And Jed made a sound in response that was pure relief. And Clover lifted her head and began doing what mares do when they understand their foal is alive. Elowen sat back on her heels in the straw. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, the adrenaline leaving. That was all. The cold was moving in now that the work was done, settling into her wet clothes, and her wet hair, and her fingers, and her feet. The coat Garrett had lent her was soaked through across the sleeves. Her boots had soaked through an hour ago. Jed was laughing quietly, still crouched by the mare's head. "You did that," he said to Elowen. "That's what you did." She tried to say something, and her teeth clicked together instead. Garrett had her on her feet before she registered he'd moved. His hands on her arms, not grabbing, steadying. He looked at her face, and his expression went sharp in a practical way. "We need to get her inside," he said to his brothers. The ranch house was 100 yards away. In a blizzard, it was a long 100 yards. They made it to the small cabin beside the barn that the hands used for lambing season closer, and already heated by a small cast-iron stove that someone had left burning. It was 1 room, spare and functional. A stove, a bench, 2 chairs, a work table. The stove was throwing serious heat, and the room was warm in a way that felt almost aggressive after the barn. Elowen's core temperature had dropped more than she'd realized. The shaking was deeper now, involuntary, her body burning through its reserves, trying to generate heat it couldn't find. She sat on the bench, and concentrated on breathing, and felt the warmth of the room working against the cold that had taken root in her. The three brothers moved around her with the same efficiency they'd shown in the stall. Jed fed the stove. Thorne found blankets in a cedar chest and assessed her condition with calm medical practicality. Garrett stripped off his wet outer coat and then, without ceremony, moved behind her on the bench. Then Thorne settled in, close on one side, Jed on the other. Their warmth was immediate and substantial. Three large men who'd been working in a heated barn, their body temperature still high, surrounding her on three sides. The blankets went around all of them. She was still shaking. Her fingers were white at the tips. The kind of cold that has gotten into muscle and bone takes time to shift. Garrett's voice came from close behind her, low and sure. The kind of voice that expects to be heard, not because it's loud, but because it knows what it's saying matters. "Close your legs," he said, feeling our warmth, and then Jed and Thorne, in quiet unison, repeated it against her skin like a promise. "Close your legs," feeling our warmth. It was a practical instruction with an impractical weight to it. Her legs had been apart in the working stance she'd held for 2 hours. Every muscle in her lower body still braced for effort. She let them close. She let the blanket seal around them. The heat moved in from all sides, and her body began, finally, to answer it. The shaking slowed. Her fingers found color at the tips. The tightness in her chest released in increments. And in that small, warm room, with the blizzard pressing against the walls and the new foal alive in the barn, 20 steps away, something shifted in the space between the four of them. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It was simply the recognition passing, between all of them, without words that they had moved through something real together, and come out the other side changed. Elowen leaned back against Garrett's chest by small degrees, and he let her, and the warmth between them, built in a slow and mutual way that was entirely its own thing. Jed's shoulder was solid against her right side. Thorne's hand covered both of hers where they rested in her lap, warming her fingers back to life with deliberate patience. What passed between them in that cabin in the following hours belonged only to them, a reckoning with warmth and relief, and the particular vulnerability of having almost lost something and then not losing it. It was deep, and it was tender, and it was, above everything else, mutual. Elowen was never an object in it. She was the center of it, and she chose it, and they understood that her choosing was the only thing that made any of it worth anything. The blizzard raged outside for 2 more days. Inside the cabin, they were warm. The ice cellar needed clearing on the 4th day. The blizzard had softened to a steady fall, by then still thick, still blinding in gusts, but no longer the kind of wind that knocked you sideways when you stepped outside. Garrett judged it passable enough for work and organized the hands into rotations. Snow needed moving from the barn roofs. Feed supplies needed accounting. The ice cellar, dug into the hillside 50 yards from the main house, needed to be checked and reorganized to make room for winter provisions. Elowen volunteered for the ice cellar. She liked the order of it, the cold, dry logic of a well-kept cellar, everything in its place and accounted for. It was like a ledger in 3 dimensions. She took a lantern and a notepad and went in alone, moving through the shelves with the focused pleasure of someone doing a task that suits them. The main stores were in reasonable order. Root vegetables in their bins, salt pork in its barrels, dried goods on the upper shelves in labeled sacks. She worked her way to the back wall, where the older items were kept, things that had been there since before the summer, goods that predated her arrival. That was where she found the letters. They were in a biscuit tin, of all things, pushed behind a crate of preserves on the lowest back shelf, half buried under a piece of burlap that had been there long enough to grow stiff. She almost missed them. Her hand knocked the tin while she was moving the crate, and it fell, and the lid came off, and she picked it up automatically and looked at what was inside. Envelopes. A dozen of them, maybe more. The handwriting on the outside was different from letter to letter, different hands, different inks, but several were addressed to a name she recognized from the porch, from the way Garrett had said it in the wind. Rosalind. Elowen sat down on the cold floor of the ice cellar with the lantern beside her. She knew she should stop. She had no right to private correspondence. These weren't her letters, and they weren't her history. She stacked them neatly to return them. Then one fell open. She caught it, meaning to fold it closed, and the date at the top caught her eye. August 1875, 3 years ago, and below the date, a name she recognized from a different context entirely. Hiram Sterling. She read it then, she couldn't not. It was a letter from Sterling to a supply merchant in Helena, businesslike in its language, discussing a contract. Specifically, a contract for the provision of medicinal supplies to Buckthorn Ridge Laudanum, quinine, a compound tonic that the ranch apparently ordered monthly for the management of a chronic illness. The letter instructed the merchant to alter the compound. The instructions were precise and technical, and written with the casual authority of a man who had thought about it carefully and arrived at a solution he found elegant. Reduce the quinine. Increase a secondary compound. Not enough to kill quickly, enough to weaken over months in a way that would look like the natural progression of illness. There was a second letter, same handwriting. 6 months later, discussing the results. Elowen sat on the floor of the ice cellar and read it twice. Then she sat there for a while doing nothing. Garrett's wife had been sick for 2 years before she died. She had known that much from the few things the hands had mentioned, the careful silences around the subject in the house. Rosalind had been ill. Everyone said so. Exhaustion, decline, a body that simply gave out under the pressure of mountain life. That was the story of her death. But exhaustion didn't come in a biscuit tin behind a crate of preserves. Hiram Sterling had not waited for Rosalind to give out. He had helped. He had poisoned her medicine slowly, over months, deliberately, systematically, with the goal of breaking Garrett's spirit, completely shattering the man so thoroughly that he would sell the land, or abandon it, or simply stop fighting. And if a woman died in the process, that was a cost Hiram Sterling had calculated and accepted without losing a night's sleep. She put the letters in her coat pocket with hands that were very steady. She went back to the main house. She was almost there when she smelled it. Smoke. Not wood smoke, not the clean domestic smell of the kitchen stove or the fireplaces. Something bigger, something wrong. She turned toward it, and the wind shifted, and then she could see it, above the tree line to the east. Orange light against the dark winter sky. The hay barn. She ran. The hands were already responding when she came around the corner of the main house shouts. The bucket line forming from the water pump, men silhouetted against the orange. The hay barn was fully involved. The fire had taken hold in multiple places simultaneously, which meant it hadn't started from a single source, which meant it hadn't started by accident. Through the smoke and the shouting, she saw Garrett. He was inside. She could see him through the open main doors, moving through the smoke in that deliberate way of his driving the horses out of the side stalls, refusing to leave until the animals were safe. The hands on the bucket line were yelling at him to come out. He wasn't listening. The burning beam came down without warning. She heard the crack before she saw it. Then Garrett was down in the hay, and the smoke and the orange light, one arm moving, and then the arm stopped moving, and 2 of the hands went in after him. They got him out. He was alive. Conscious but barely, a gash across his shoulder and upper back from the beam, blood soaking through his shirt in the cold. They brought him to the porch, and Elowen was already there, already pushing through to get to him, already taking stock of the wound with her hands in her eyes. "Jed," she said, "I need the medical kit from the supply room. Thorne, get him inside. Cookie, I need water on the stove, as much as you can heat." She looked at Garrett's face. His eyes were open and tracking, which was something. "You're going to be all right," she told him, and meant it to be a fact rather than a comfort. He said her name. Just her name and nothing else. The hay barn burned itself down to the frame by midnight. The winter feed supply, 6 months of provisions for over 1,000 head of cattle, was gone. In the snow, in the dark, with a blocked mountain road and a wounded man on the kitchen table, Buckthorn Ridge stood in the ruins of what it had prepared. And then Hap found the message. It was charred into the surviving timber of the barn door, the one section of the structure that had stayed standing, preserved by the damp wood and the wind direction, as if whoever had written it had known it would last. Hap came to the doorway of the kitchen, and he looked at Garrett, and then at Elowen, and then he said it out loud. Hand over the land and the woman, or freeze to death together. Silence in the kitchen. Elowen was at the table, with her hands still pressed against Garrett's wound, waiting for the water to heat, the letters from the ice cellar sitting in her coat pocket against her side. All around her, the house was full of people. 35 men in various states of cold and soot and fear, and outside the blizzard was still going, and the barn was still burning at its edges, and the road down the mountain was buried under 4 feet of snow. She thought about the letter. About Rosalind. About what Hiram Sterling thought human beings were for. Garrett opened his eyes and looked at her. He's not getting either, he said. His voice was rough but steady. Elowen held his gaze. No, she said. He's not. She turned back to the wound and kept working. And the kitchen was quiet around them. And somewhere out in the dark and the cold, the winter was just beginning. The morning after the fire, Buckthorn Ridge looked like a place that had lost a battle. Black timber ribs stood where the hay barn had been, still smoking in the cold dawn, the smell of it moving through the whole property on the wind. The snow around the ruin was gray with ash. The hands moved through their morning chores, quieter than usual, with the particular heaviness of people who have watched something irreplaceable burn and know that the arithmetic of survival has just changed substantially. Elowen was up before anyone else. She stood in the kitchen and did the mathematics in her head while the coffee heated. She had been through the supply ledgers enough times to know the numbers without looking. 6 months of feed, gone. Winter provisions for over 1,000 head of cattle, gone. The mountain road was buried. The nearest supply depot was 40 miles down a pass that no wagon could navigate in current conditions. The ranch's cash reserves, which she also knew by heart, were enough to rebuild eventually, but not enough to replace feed midwinter at emergency prices. Even if emergency prices were accessible, which they were not. She wrote it all down in 2 columns. What they had, what they needed, the gap between the two. Then she wrote a 3rd column, what they could do. Garrett was in the spare room off the kitchen, where they'd moved him the night before. She checked on him first thing. He was feverish but coherent, the wound cleaned and bound with linen strips soaked in the willow bark and yarrow tincture she'd found in Cookie's medicinal stores. The fever was the infection's first push. She knew from experience that it would get worse before it got better. She left a cup of cooled willow bark tea on the table beside him and told him to drink it whether he wanted to or not. He looked at the cup and then at her. You're already managing things, he said. Someone has to. She adjusted the bandaging at his shoulder. That's not a complaint. Rest? He rested. Thorne was in the study when she got there, already at the ledger, his face carrying the kind of careful composure that costs something to maintain. She put her 2-column summary on the desk in front of him, and he looked at it without speaking for a full minute. It's worse than I calculated, he said. It's about what I calculated, she said, which means it's bad, but it's workable if we're strict about it. She sat down across from him. I want to go through every storage point on this property today. The root cellar, the smoke room, the emergency stores in the upper barn, the kitchen reserves, everything. And I want an honest count. Cookie won't like someone going through his kitchen. Cookie will understand that this is not about his kitchen. She paused. He'll grumble. He'll comply. Thorne allowed himself a small, tired smile. Probably. They spent the morning counting. Elowen, Thorne, and Hap moved through every storage point on the property with a clipboard and an oil lantern, and the honest count was delivered to Elowen's third column by midday. It was not comfortable reading, but it was not nothing. There was enough if they were disciplined. If everyone accepted that disciplined meant equal. That was the part she was less sure about. 35 men, accustomed to the hierarchy of ranch life, accustomed to the understanding that management ate better than labor, were about to be asked to share a single standard of shortage. Some of them would accept that without argument. Some would not. And fear, in a cold room with dwindling food, had a way of moving faster than reason. She found out how fast at supper. It started with two of the younger Hands brothers from Kansas. Elowen had learned, who had been with the ranch for less than a season. One of them stood up from the bench before the food was served and said clearly that he didn't see why the foreman's table got a double portion when the situation was what it was. Hap's face went dark. Several of the older Hands straightened up. It could have gone badly in about 4 different ways. Elowen stood up before anyone else could speak. She went to the serving table. She took her own bowl, her supper, what she'd allocated for herself, and she carried it to the long common table and set it down in the row with the Hands. Then she sat down there, in the middle of them, and looked around the room. People watched her. "Sit down," she said to Hap before he could escalate. She said it plainly, and without edge. He sat slowly. She looked at the room, at the 35 faces, tired and cold and scared in varying degrees, at Cookie in the kitchen doorway holding a ladle, watching, at Jed standing near the back wall with his arms crossed, reading the room the same way she was. "I want to be clear about what's happening here," she said. "Not what might happen, not what we're afraid of. What's actually happening." She kept her voice even. "We have a difficult winter ahead of us. Our feed stores are damaged. Our road is closed. And we have a man who thinks he can use our difficulty against us." Nobody moved. "He's counting on fear," she said. "Fear makes people turn on each other. It makes men who have worked side by side for years start measuring each other's portions and questioning each other's loyalty. And if we do that, if we let that happen in this room, then Hiram Sterling doesn't need to send another man up this mountain. We'll do the work for him." The Kansas boy had sat back down sometime in the middle of that. She hadn't noticed exactly when. "There are no bosses or servants here tonight," she said. "We are human beings standing equal against the storm. Respect isn't built on guns or money. It's built on how we share our very last crumb of bread in a blizzard." She looked at her bowl, sitting in the row with the Hands. "The portions are equal from tonight forward," she said. "Everyone in this room, management and labor, family and hired, equal. If that changes, it changes for everyone at once, and I'll tell you when and why before it does." She picked up her spoon. "Now let's eat what we have and stop wasting heat arguing." There was a silence. Then Cookie came out of the kitchen with the serving pot, and he went down the line, starting at the far end, not the foreman's table, not the buckthorn chairs, the far end, where the youngest and most junior Hands sat. He served from there, and he moved up the line, and he served everyone the same amount that, murmuring when it started, was different from before. It was the sound of people exhaling, settling, finding the floor under them again. Jed caught her eye from across the room. He gave her a small nod. Over the next week, she built a system. She and Thorne rationed the grain stores with the precision of a military quartermaster, accounting for every head of livestock and every person on the property. She reorganized the kitchen rotation so that nothing was wasted. Scraps went to stock, bones went to broth, broth went into everything. Cookie, who had initially received her kitchen reorganization with professional suspicion, became within 3 days her most rigorous enforcer. "These people have been eating like there's no winter," he told her, on day 4, with the grim satisfaction of a man who had always suspected this and was vindicated. "I've been saying it for years." "You were right," she said. "Now we fix it." He handed her the spice inventory without being asked. She checked on Garrett every morning and every evening. The fever peaked on day 3. She spent most of that night in the chair beside his bed, monitoring, keeping the willow bark tea going, changing the compress on his wound when it needed it. By day 5, the fever broke, and he came back to himself in degrees. On day 7, he was sitting up and asking about the herd. The herd is fine, she told him. Hap's been rotating them to the sheltered lower pasture. The hay situation is being managed. And the men? The men are eating the same as everyone else, and they're calmer for it. She set the morning tea on his table. Human beings can accept hardship. What they can't accept is unfairness. Once you make things fair, people find their footing. Garrett looked at her for a moment. Where did you learn that? From watching what happens when it's not true, she said simply. He was quiet. I should be up. There are things that need. There are things being handled, she said. You're not the only person on this ridge who can handle things. She stood. Drink the tea. He drank the tea. Outside, the blizzard had softened to a manageable cold, and Elowen moved through the property each day like a repair person who knows that fixing one thing leads to the next and the next. She learned the ranch in those weeks of hardship more thoroughly than she'd learned it in the weeks of ordinary operation. Hardship had a way of making the structure of things visible. She was learning Buckthorn Ridge the way you learn a person through what it did when it was pushed. By the end of the second week, the hands were calling her by her first name. That was new. They'd been careful before, formal in the slightly awkward way of men who aren't sure of someone's position. Now they said Elowen the way. They said Hap or Jed, as if she'd been there long enough to belong to the place, and the place had decided to belong to her back. That mattered more than she let show. It was Thorne who said it first. He came to find her in the study on a Tuesday morning 11 days into the blizzard's aftermath, with the road still buried and the grain stores at roughly 60% of what they needed to carry the herd through to spring. He sat down across from her desk and put his numbers next to her numbers, and they looked at them together in silence for a while. We can hold another 2 weeks at current consumption, he said. 3 if we make cuts that will affect the animals, which creates a different problem in spring. Animals that make it through a hard winter half-starved can't work in spring, she said, and they'll be more vulnerable to illness. Correct. He folded his hands. So we need supply before 2 weeks. The road's closed. The road to town is closed, he said. There's another route, north and west, through Deadman's Pass. She looked up. She had heard the name twice in her time on the ridge. Both times, the person saying it had done so, in a tone that communicated clearly that Deadman's Pass was the option you considered, only when the other options were genuinely gone. It was a high-altitude route, through a narrow canyon, passable on horseback, but not by wagon, brutal in winter. And it came out on the western slope of the range, near the lands of a Native American tribe the Buckthorns had a long, and by all accounts respectful history with. Has Jed ridden it in winter? She asked, once, 3 years ago. Thorne paused. He made it. She went to find Jed. He was in the barn with the horses, doing what he did when he was thinking, moving through the stalls, with a brush and a quiet that was unusual for him. She stood at the stall door and explained the mathematics, and watched his face work through it. Deadman's in February, he said, when she finished. It's not the same pass it is in September. I know the canyon section ices over. The ledge trail near the top narrows to about 4 feet and drops 200 feet on the south side. I know. He looked at her. You want to come? It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. You know the pass. I know medicine. The Arapaho village will have sick people in winter, they always do. If I can offer something useful, we're more likely to come back with what we need. She held his gaze. And I won't send you through Deadman's Pass alone while I stay here by the stove. Jed was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, which meant he'd already decided. We leave at dawn, he said. Dress in everything you own. She told Garrett that evening. He was up by then, moving carefully, the wound still pulling when he turned too fast. He stood in the kitchen doorway while she explained the plan, and his face went through several things in quick succession before settling into something that was not quite acceptance, but was adjacent to it. "The pass is dangerous," he said. "Everything on this mountain is dangerous in February," she said. "But this is the path that works. Jed will keep you safe. Jed and I will keep each other safe," she said. "That's how it works." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and adjusted the collar of her coat, a small, careful gesture, and didn't say anything else. She understood him well enough by then to know that the gesture was everything he had to offer, and that it was substantial. The past deserved its name. They left at first light, Elowen on Birdie, Jed on his roan gelding, saddlebags loaded with what they could carry, and what Elowen had put together from her medical stores: clean linen, a fever tincture, the remaining quinine, dried herbs, and paper packets labeled in her small, clear handwriting. The sky was a hard, pale blue, cloudless, the kind of winter clear that looks gentle and isn't. The lower trail was manageable. Birdie picked her way through the snow with her usual careful intelligence, and Jed rode slightly ahead, reading the terrain with the instinctive fluency of someone who has spent years learning what mountains communicate, and in what language. The canyon section started 4 miles in. The walls rose on both sides, gray rock striped with ice, narrowing the sky to a ribbon above them. The sound changed in their hooves on ice instead of snow, the echo bouncing strangely, every noise amplified and wrong. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the space of a quarter mile. Birdie slowed without being asked. Elowen kept her weight low, and her hands light on the reins, and her eyes on the trail ahead. She had made a decision about fear. Somewhere in the lower canyon she would acknowledge it, because ignoring fear was not wisdom, it was carelessness, and carelessness on an iced ledge 4 feet wide was a specific kind of fatal. She would know the fear was there, and she would continue anyway. "Talk to me," she told Jed. He talked. He told her about the first time he'd ridden this pass, 17 years old and stupid, on a bet that he now understood had been designed to get him killed because he'd been annoying someone at a card game. He told her about Clover's mother, who had been born on the ridge and had been the most difficult horse he'd ever loved. He told her about the summer. Garrett had taught him to read, properly read, because their schooling had been irregular, and Garrett had decided this was unacceptable and had sat with him every evening for 3 months until he could read anything put in front of him. She listened, and they moved, and the ledge came and went in about 15 minutes that felt considerably longer, and when the canyon opened out onto the western slope, they both exhaled at approximately the same time. "There," Jed said. The village was in a protected valley below the pass, sheltered on 3 sides by rock and timber, smoke rising from a dozen fires into the cold, still air. It was larger than she'd expected, well established, the kind of community that had read this landscape for generations and built itself accordingly. Jed knew the protocol. He called out before they descended, waited, called again. A rider came up to meet them, young man watchful, who looked at Jed and apparently recognized him and said something that Jed answered. They were brought in. Elowen dismounted in the center of the village and looked around without performing anything. No nervousness, no forced friendliness, no performance of goodwill. Just a woman looking at a place and trying to understand it. An elder came to meet them, white-haired, deliberate in movement, with the kind of attention in his face that comes from decades of reading situations accurately. He and Jed spoke. Jed translated in both directions, and Elowen listened to the elder's cadence even when she couldn't follow the words. She asked Jed to ask about illness. The elder looked at her when this was translated, a long, assessing look. Then he spoke. 3 children, Jed said. Chest illness. Fever. She unslung her medical bag. She spent 2 hours with the sick children, examined each one carefully, asked questions through Jed, explained what she was doing and why before she did it. The quinine for the fever. A chest poultice made from herbs that she explained to the mother in detail, through Jed, so that the mother understood the treatment and could continue it after Elowen was gone. She wrote down the instructions in clear, simple language and handed the paper to Jed to translate at leisure. She was not performing charity. She was doing medicine, carefully and respectfully, for patients who needed it. There was no difference in her manner from how she worked with the ranch hands, or with Garrett. The elder watched all of it. When she was finished, he came to where she was packing her bag and spoke to her directly, not through Jed, to her, with a seriousness that needed no translation. Then he looked at Jed and spoke again. Jed's expression moved through something complicated. He says Jed translated that the Buckthorns have always dealt fairly with his people. He says he can see that you carry the same understanding. A pause. And he says that people who know how to be humble in someone else's home are welcome to return to it. Elowen looked at the elder and inclined her head. He inclined his back. The dry meat and grain were loaded onto Bertie and the roan in careful packs that distributed the weight evenly enough to carry the ranch herd through the remaining weeks. Enough to matter. It wasn't abundance. It was survival, offered by people who understood survival and had decided the Buckthorns were worth the extension of trust. She thought about that on the ride back, about what trust was built on, not on grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but on consistency, on showing up the same way every time, on making the small, fair choices so reliably that when the stakes are high, people already know what to expect from you. The Buckthorns had spent years building that. She had spent her weeks on the ridge, trying to operate by the same standard. Today it had been enough. The pass was harder eastbound, into the wind, but they made it before dark. When they came down the last trail and the lights of Buckthorn Ridge appeared, through the trees, Elowen let herself feel it, the relief of return, the satisfaction of a difficult thing done. Jed rode beside her, with his hat pulled low and his posture carrying the quiet contentment of a man who has done something worth doing. Garrett was on the porch. He watched them come down the trail, and he didn't move. Just stood there in the cold with his coat open and his arms still held slightly away from his body, where the wound was healing. When they were close enough that she could see his face clearly, she saw something in it that she recognized. It was the look of a man who had spent a day at the edge of being afraid and was not going to say so. "You made it," he said. "We made it," she said. "And we brought enough." He looked at the packs on the horses. Then back at her. He nodded once, slowly. And that was all, and it was plenty. The roads opened on a Wednesday. Not fully just enough. A narrow channel carved by the wind through the lower pass, wide enough for a rider moving carefully. Thorne heard about it from one of the hands who'd gone to check the creek crossing. And he came back to the house and said it quietly, the way you say something that matters before you've decided what it means. Elowen was already at the desk. She had been at the desk for 3 days, working the financial trail she and Thorne had started building before the fire. The supply invoices, the delivery records, the inventory counts she'd done herself. On the day after arrival, she had laid it all out in sequence, and the sequence told a story, and the story was worse than she'd initially thought. Garrett came to stand in the study doorway that evening, moving carefully, his olfactory still pulling. He looked at the papers spread across the desk. "Tell me." She set down her pen, the hay delivered in October. From Mercer's contact in Billings, the same merchant who'd been overcharging on the grain. She pulled a sample report she'd had Hap compile after the fire. What they found in the remaining hay that didn't burn the stuff stored in the upper barn was roughly 40% usable forage. The rest was rotted straw and sawdust packed inside the bales to meet weight. She watched his face. It wasn't just bad hay. The ratio was engineered. Enough good material on the outside of the bales to pass a surface inspection. Enough filler inside to make it look fine until winter, when it was too late to replace. Garrett was quiet. The cattle were already being weakened before the river contamination even started, she said. Sterling wasn't improvising. He's been working this plan for at least 8 months, possibly longer. She paused. Which means the fire wasn't desperation. It was the next step. He thought we'd already be weakened enough that a fire would finish it. Yes, he miscalculated. She almost smiled. He did. Thorne came in and pulled up a chair without asking. He had his own notes. They spread everything across the desk together. Elowin's supply analysis, Thorne's financial records, the letters from the ice cellar, the forage samples. It was a mosaic of fraud and deliberate harm, and it was laid out properly. Damning we can't take this to the county sheriff, Thorne said. Fuller is Sterling's man. He's been his man for years. I know, Elowin said. That's why I'm not writing to the county sheriff. She had already addressed the envelope sitting at the corner of the desk. There's a circuit court judge in Helena, Judge Emmett Carver. He has no connection to Sterling's operation. I checked the land filings, the water rights documents, the mining licenses. Sterling hasn't purchased that particular relationship yet. She looked at both of them. I've been writing to him for 2 days. The invoices, the medical records on the cattle, the water contamination evidence, the letters about Rosalind. She looked at Garrett, all of it, organized and sourced. Garrett looked at the envelope for a long moment. Something moved through his face that he kept controlled. The letters about Rosalind, he said. Yes, she didn't soften it. They're the clearest evidence of premeditation. They establish that Sterling doesn't consider human life a constraint on his planning. That matters legally. She held his gaze. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. I found them in the ice cellar, and I needed to understand what they were before I brought them to you. He was quiet for long enough that she couldn't read him. Then he said, You're right. They needed to be in the letter. She exhaled slowly. The road opens Wednesday, Thorne said. Enough for a rider. Hap can make it to the postal relay at the junction, Elowin said. From there it goes east. Helena in 4 days, maybe 5. Garrett was still looking at the envelope, and if Sterling moves before we hear back, then we have 35 men and 3 brothers who know this land better than anyone Sterling can hire. She stood up and straightened the stack of papers. But I'd rather win this with documentation than with rifles. Rifles settle things for a day. A court record settles them for good. Thorne made a sound that was as close to approval as he usually got. He started making copies of the key documents in his precise, unhurried hand. Garrett crossed the room. He stopped in front of her desk, close enough that she could see the weariness in his face, not weakness, but the accumulated weight of a very long stretch of carrying things. He reached out and took her hand, her palm rough from weeks of work in his rougher still. He turned it over once, like he was looking at something. I thought I chose you because you wouldn't break, he said. His voice was low and careful, the way it always was when something mattered. I was wrong. He looked up. I love you because you taught us how to live again. She did not look away. She let it sit there in the air between them, solid and real. Don't get sentimental, she said quietly. We still have to win. He didn't let go of her hand. Thorne kept writing. Hap rode out at first light Wednesday morning with the envelope in his coat and instructions to stop for nothing short of a collapsed trail. They watched him go from the porch and then turned back to the work of a ranch that was still standing, still running, still managing the gap between what it had and what it needed. Garrett stood beside her on the porch until the rider disappeared into the trees. Spring, he said. Spring, she agreed. They went back inside. Sterling came on a Friday. They had 12 hours warning. A mining family from the valley, the woman from the laundry line, whose name was Clara, sent her oldest boy up the trail on horseback. With a message that Hap's wife had written out in plain language, Sterling's men were gathering. Armed, 12 of them that Clara had counted, plus Sterling himself, plus a man she didn't recognize who had the look of a lawyer or a hired witness. Elowin read the note and handed it to Garrett. He read it standing at the kitchen table and then set it down flat and looked at Hap. Hap nodded once. No elaboration needed. He went out to organize the hands. Thorne took the copy documents from the study, everything Elowin had sent to Helena, duplicated, and put them in the fireproof iron box under the floorboards of the supply room. In case, he said. She didn't ask in case of what. Jed checked his rifle, then helped her move the wounded hands from exposed positions. 2 men had taken injuries during the fire that still slowed them. She got them to the back room of the main house with enough supplies and clear instructions. "You're not going to the front," Jed told her. "I'm going to the porch," she said. He started to argue. "I'm going to the porch," she said again, pleasantly, "with the documents." He looked at her for a second. Then he handed her a small pistol from the rack by the door. "In case," he said, which was exactly what Thorne had said. The Buckthorne brothers and 20 of the 35 hands spread out across the ridge, the fence line, the barn approach, the upper trail, the tree line to the east. It was done quietly and efficiently, the way the ranch did most things. Hap had been drilling these men for years on exactly this kind of readiness. It showed. Elowen stood on the front porch with a wool blanket around her shoulders and the documents in a leather satchel at her hip, and she waited. Sterling arrived at midday. He rode in through the main gate with 11 armed men and the unfamiliar lawyer behind him. And he came up the approach road at a deliberate pace that was meant to communicate inevitability. He looked at the house and the hands positioned around it, and he looked at Elowen on the porch, and something moved behind his eyes that wasn't quite surprise, but was close to it. He'd expected more fear. She could see that clearly. "Miss Vance," he said, pulling up at the foot of the porch steps. He had the professional voice on, smooth, almost friendly. "You've put the Buckthorne brothers in a difficult position. I want you to understand that's not a reflection on them. You came here under false pretenses and led them into decisions they wouldn't have made without your influence." She listened to all of it, without changing her expression. "The debt on this property," he continued, "is now callable. The merchant contracts you've been disputing were filed and legally binding. The water rights to the southern river basin were legally obtained. I'm here with witnesses to formalize the transfer." He looked at the armed hands on the fence line. "This doesn't have to be complicated." "You're right," Elowen said. "It doesn't." She reached into the satchel. "What I have here," she said, keeping her voice level and clear, "are certified copies of the original supply invoices showing contracted versus invoiced prices, which your associate fraudulently inflated across 14 separate orders. A water contamination report, signed by 2 Valley ranchers and witnessed, documenting the source of industrial runoff traced to your mining operation. Laboratory correspondence documenting the alteration of Rosalind Buckthorne's medicine in your handwriting and that of the Helena apothecary you paid." She looked at him steadily. "And correspondence from the circuit court in Helena, confirming receipt of all of the above materials, stamped 6 days ago." Silence. One of Sterling's men shifted in the saddle. The lawyer had gone completely still. "Montana Statute Section 44, she continued, prohibits the fraudulent alteration of contracted supply agreements. Section 91 covers deliberate contamination of shared water sources, and there is no section number required for the knowing administration of a poisonous substance to a person, because that falls under criminal law that precedes statutes entirely." She paused. I read slowly, but I read thoroughly. Sterling's face had stopped moving, then the sound of hooves on the lower road. More than a few, the kind of measured, deliberate approach that Sterling's arrival had lacked. The county sheriff came through the gate first, and behind him, a man in a good coat on a gray horse, who had the bearing of someone who had ridden 4 days, and considered it unremarkable. Judge Emmett Carver looked exactly like a man who had read Elowen's letter carefully, and had formed clear opinions. Carver pulled up beside Sterling's group. He looked at the lawyer, who looked at the ground. He looked at Sterling, who had gone to a kind of stillness that Elowen recognized as a man doing fast arithmetic on bad numbers. "Hiram Sterling," Carver said, "you're under arrest pending a formal hearing on charges including fraud, willful contamination of a shared water source, and the deliberate poisoning of Rosalind Buckthorne, deceased. He looked at the sheriff. Please see to it. Garrett stepped off the porch. He walked down the steps and through the yard, and he stopped about 10 feet from Sterling, and he just looked at him. Not with fury, something past fury, something cold and settled. Sterling met his eyes and then looked away first. The sheriff did what he was told. Elowen stood on the porch and watched it happen, the leather satchel in her hands, and she thought about a woman she had never met, who had stood somewhere on this property and been slowly, systematically robbed of her future by a man who had calculated that her life was an acceptable cost. She thought about the children at the well in the mining settlement. She thought about Clara's boy riding up a mountain in the cold to warn them. She thought about what it meant to make something right, not just to win, but to make it right. Jed appeared at her shoulder. He looked at the scene in the yard and let out a long breath. You knew they'd come today. I knew the timing of the letter, she said. I knew when Helena would receive it. I gave Carver a specific date. She paused. I sent a second letter to Clara's husband to tell him which day, so he could watch for Sterling to move. Jed was quiet for a moment. You coordinated the ambush. I organized the information, she said. There's a difference. He grinned. It was the same grin from the depot platform, on the first morning, when everything was still uncertain and cold. It hadn't changed much. There really isn't, he said. Spring came slowly to Blackwood Valley, the way it always came to high country, not all at once, but in small, persistent arguments against the cold. A strip of mud at the edge of the trail. A week of days that reached 40 degrees before falling back. The creek running faster than it had in February, carrying the snow off the ridgeline in a sound that was underneath everything else, constant and quiet and reassuring. Elowen noticed the willows first. They went green before anything else did, thin branches, catching color, while the rest of the valley was still gray-brown and uncertain. She was on Birdie when she saw it, riding the south pasture fence line in early March, and she stopped the mare and sat there for a while, looking at the color and feeling something in her chest that she didn't immediately have a word for. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was closer to recognition. The cattle in the south pasture were recovering. The contamination had cleared from the water source. Once Sterling's operation was shut down, confirmed by the territorial inspector who'd come out in February as part of Carver's proceeding. The animals were moving and eating and carrying themselves the way they should, and the numbers Hap brought her every morning were moving in the right direction. Not fast. Right. The legal process was methodical. Carver ran it that way, which was the only way it worked. Sterling's hearing took 3 weeks, and the evidence was what it was clear and documented and witnessed, and the outcome was what it should have been. He wouldn't be returning to Blackwood Valley. The land claims and water rights he'd filed were declared void under the fraud statutes. The mining operation was shut down permanently. The mining family stayed. That had been something Elowen had not expected and had not arranged. They simply stayed. The operation they'd worked for was gone, but the valley was not. Some of the men hired on with neighboring ranches. Clara and her husband bought a small plot on the eastern flat and started a kitchen garden that would have room to grow into something real by summer. Their children, who had been sick all fall, were well now. That was not a small thing. On the last Saturday of March, Elowen rode into Cutter's Bend with a hand-lettered notice she had written at the desk 3 evenings running. She posted it at the general store, the postal relay, and the church door. It described a schoolhouse and a medical clinic to be built on the Buckthorn Ridge property that spring, funded by a portion of the ranch's earnings and open to every child and worker in the valley without charge and without distinction. The woman behind the counter at the general store read it twice. Then she looked at Elowen over her spectacles. You already run a cattle operation, manage the books, and nearly single-handedly brought down Hiram Sterling. A pause. Now you're starting a school. Starting it Elowen said. I need a teacher who wants to stay. The woman looked at her for a long moment. My niece trained in Philadelphia. She's been looking for a place. She set the notice on the counter. I'll write to her. Elowen rode back up the mountain. The building started in April. Thorne handled the contracts with the precision she'd come to count on, negotiating with the lumber merchant and the stonemason, and two of the hands who turned out to have carpentry skills nobody had ever had cause to use before. Jed rode for materials twice a week and came back each time with something extra. He hadn't been asked for a box of chalk, a set of reading primers, a small iron bell that he hung from the schoolhouse eave, and rang once, experimentally, and then looked very pleased with himself about. Cookie, unprompted, declared himself responsible for the clinic's medicine stores and reorganized them with the specific authority of a man who has decided a thing is now his domain and will not be argued with. Elowen did not argue. Garrett worked with a longer range of motion each week. The shoulder healed the way his brother had predicted. It would slowly, stubbornly, on its own timetable. He was never idle while it healed. He just shifted what he did, moving from physical work to the oversight and decisions that had accumulated during the winter, and Elowen watched him settle back into himself with a steadiness that was different from before. Quieter in some ways, more present. He found her one evening at the end of April, where she'd taken to sitting on the east side of the ridge to watch the light go off the valley. The view was better from there than from the front porch. She had discovered it in January, riding Birdie in the early morning, and she had kept it mostly to herself. He sat down beside her on the flat rock she used as a bench. He didn't ask what she was looking at. He just looked at it, too. They sat there for a while. The valley below was softening into spring colors. The cottonwood along the creek gone fully yellow-green. The grass in the lower pasture a real green now, and not the pale suggestion of one. The mountains above were still white at the peaks, but the line was retreating. Jed wants to put in a second corral, Garrett said. Argues we've outgrown the existing configuration. He's right, Elowen said. I've been looking at the foaling numbers. If Clover's numbers hold, and we add the two mares Hap sourced last fall, we'll need the space by August. A pause. I know, he said. Then why are you telling me instead of telling him yes? He looked at her sideways. The corner of his mouth moved. I wanted to sit here first. She let that sit. The light changed. It was doing something particular to the valley, turning the far ridge amber and the creek silver. At the same time, the kind of late afternoon color that made things look briefly like they were made of something other than ordinary material. I've been thinking about the ring, Garrett said. She looked at him. He reached into his coat pocket. What he set on his knee was a ring silver, with a green stone that caught the last light in a way that reminded her immediately of the valley they were looking at. Not elaborate, precisely right. Jed picked the stone, he said. Thorne did the metal work. I decided when. He paused. I'm asking. She looked at the ring, then at him, then at the valley for just a moment, because she had learned something in her months on Buckthorn Ridge about not rushing through things that deserved to be felt fully. Yes, she said. Not quickly, not slowly, like a fact she had known for a while and was simply confirming. He put the ring on her hand. The silver was warm from his pocket. Below them, somewhere on the ridge, she could hear Jed's voice carrying on the evening air, laughing about something, explaining something to one of the hands. And in the other direction, the faint sound of Thorne closing the barn door at the end of the day, the iron latch clicking shut with its familiar weight. The schoolhouse framing was visible from here, if you knew where to look. Dark timber against the pale hillside, the little bell catching light at the peak of the roof. It would be finished by June. The teacher was coming in May. Elowen looked at the ring on her finger and thought about where she had stood in September position, 12 out of 12, at the end of a platform in the snow, holding a carpet bag with both hands, while a man with polished boots told her that a roof was more than she could expect. She thought about the choice she had made and what it had grown into, and how none of it had been inevitable, which was the thing that made it matter. It had required work and stubbornness and the willingness to be honest in rooms where honesty was inconvenient. It had required choosing, again and again, to treat people as people, to see a problem and move toward it instead of away, to believe that fairness was not naive but practical, not idealism, but the only architecture that actually held weight. She had built something real here, with three complicated men who had been willing to be changed by it, with 35 hands who had found their footing when she'd asked them to stand level, with a valley that had been waiting, maybe, for someone to stop treating it as something to be taken and start treating it as something to be kept. The last light went off the peaks. She leaned slightly into Garrett's shoulder, and he let her, and behind them the ridge was quiet and solid and theirs. And below them the valley stretched, out in the spring evening, full of what they had made of it and what it would yet become. Somewhere, the small iron bell on the schoolhouse eve caught the last of the wind and rang once, clear and brief and carrying. Then the evening settled, and the valley went dark, and the mountains held their peace. And on Buckthorn Ridge the lamps came on one by one, warm light filling the windows of a home that had learned what it was made of and found it was enough. Cutter's Bend, September 1878. Snow falling, one woman left at the end of the line. That's where this story begins. And everything that follows the frozen mountain, the poisoned river, the burning barn, the blizzard that nearly killed them all, every single bit of it comes back to one quiet moment where Elowen Vance picked up her bag and chose to believe that she was worth more than a roof over her head. That's the first thing this story teaches us. Know your own worth before anyone else gets to decide it for you. Elowen stood at position 12 out of 12. No family, no connections, no one fighting in her corner. And she still said no to a man who offered her scraps and called it kindness. She waited, not out of pride, out of clarity. She knew the difference between being chosen and being used, and she refused to confuse the two. The second thing is, this dignity isn't something you earn by being perfect. You earn it by being honest. Elowen didn't win over Cookie by performing charm. She didn't win over the ranch hands by being likable. She walked into that kitchen and told the truth about the sourdough starter. She stayed up all night and told the truth about the ledgers. She stood up in that town meeting and told the truth about the water. Every room she walked into, she brought the same person. That consistency is what made people trust her, and trust in a hard winter is the only currency that actually spends. The third thing, and maybe the most important, is that real strength doesn't look like never needing anyone. It looks like Elowen shaking from cold in that small cabin, letting three men she'd known for weeks wrap blankets around her, letting herself be held. That took more courage than riding Deadman's Pass. Because asking for help, receiving warmth, allowing yourself to be seen in your vulnerability, that's not weakness. That's what makes connection possible. Elowen understood something a lot of people spend their whole lives learning. You cannot build something real with people you won't let see you. And then there's what she built. A schoolhouse, a clinic, equal portions at the supper table. She didn't just survive that winter. She used it to show everyone around her what fairness actually looks like in practice. Not as a speech, not as a principle, as a bowl of food served to the most junior hand first. That's leadership. Not the kind that comes from authority, the kind that comes from deciding every single day to treat the person in front of you as fully human. Hiram Sterling thought human lives were assets to be leveraged and liabilities to be eliminated. He was wrong, and the story proves it. Because every person he underestimated, the woman he called past her bloom, the miners he poisoned alongside the cattle, the children at the contaminated well, every one of them became part of the reason he lost. He planned for property. He forgot about people. And people when treated with respect, will ride through a blizzard for you. So if you take one thing from this story, let it be that. Treat people like people. Show up the same way, whether the room is watching or not. Share the last crumb. Say the hard, true thing in the hard room. And when someone offers you their warmth, in whatever form that takes, let yourself feel it. That's what Elowin did. That's why Buckthorn Ridge survived. And that small iron bell on the schoolhouse roof, ringing once in the evening wind, is the sound of everything she built from nothing in the coldest winter anyone on that mountain could remember. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or historical events is purely coincidental.